All right, so we're on section 3, and we talked a little bit about Sumer, but I want to start this by reading a fascinating piece of advice from a father to his son that was written 4,000 years ago. Why do you idle about? Go to school and recite your assignment. After you have finished, come to me. Do not wander about in the street. Now, do you know what I said? Things haven't changed much, have they? I mean, do some of you hear that sometimes from your own parents? Yeah. And so this was 4,000 years ago. Humans are humans in every time period. And that's one of the things I really like to impress on my world history class. The history we're studying, these people were not like different creatures. They were humans like us. They fell in love. They lost children and mourned. They had crushes on people. I mean, they were regular human beings, and sometimes I think we treat them like some weird thing that was way back there. But they're not, and this is one example. Now, not only did the father give his advice to the son, but he made him copy it as a scribe in cuneiform so he would remember the advice. So the Sumerians, very advanced for the things that they had that they could do in that time period. They didn't have technology. The wheel had been invented earlier, but they made wheeled vehicles. They were the first ones to do that. I'm going to hand out some maps to you of the area that we're talking about. And so could you pass these out, and could you pass these out to the class? And we're going to take a look at this in a little bit. I wanted you to have them. But you can, for now, look in your book on page 35. And what's the green area on page 35 on the map? What's that called?
Fertile.
Mesopotamia. And do you remember what Mesopotamia means?
Land between the rivers.
Yes, land between the rivers. And indeed it is. What are the two rivers?
Tigris and Euphrates.
Tigris and Euphrates. So we talked about all these early civilizations were near water. Who can tell me what Egypt was near?
Nile.
The Nile. What about India?
It was the Indus and the Ganges.
Yes, the Indus and the Ganges. And what about China? Huanghe and Yangtze. Okay. So all of them were by rivers. So we're going to take a look at this a little deeper. If you look at this land, it comes up from a gulf. What's the name of the gulf that it comes up from? Thank you so much.
Persian Gulf.
The Persian Gulf. All right, good. The Persian Gulf, and there is, it goes over to the Mediterranean Sea. Now you see the area that's, the green area that's touching the Mediterranean Sea? That area is where most of Christ's ministry took place. Jesus Christ's ministry was there. And the area along this side of the sea where the green is touching, does everyone see that on page 35?
Yes.
I want you to have a mental image of this. You see how at the top right corner of the Mediterranean, it looks like a little thumb is sticking out like this? From that thumb all the way down to the bottom of the green, that is an area called the Levant. And if you look at the maps I just gave you, you can see the Mediterranean with that little thumb sticking out. And this dark circle area is the Levant. That's where Jerusalem is, and a lot of the cities that are mentioned in the Bible are in there as well. And on your other map, it's blank. But if you take this map, can you see the Tigris and Euphrates there? Can you identify them?
Yes.
Okay, what about the Persian Gulf? All right, now you've had geography, so if you move from the bottom of the map and you start moving towards the east, what's the first body of water you hit here called? It looks like a snail stretched out with his two little antennas sticking out on top. What is that body of water? That's the Red Sea. Good for you. And the Red Sea is where the story of Moses took place when he was running from the Egyptians. So just to get you some perspective on all of this. Now, we know where we are. We're between these two great rivers. And these rivers flood like the Nile did. But the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates was much harder to control. First of all, there's two of them. And they were more dangerous and more hard to work with than the Nile. The Nile was more predictable. The Egyptians waited for the flood. It left silt behind. They knew that another flood probably wouldn't come for a year. And this affected the mentality of these two groups of people. You remember that when we talked about Samaria, we found out that in the afterlife, the Sumerians thought the afterlife was what? Was it a good place or a bad place?
Very bad.
Very bad place. They didn't want to go there. It was just supposed to be a grim and miserable existence. But the Egyptians felt otherwise. They called the afterlife the happy fields of food. Now, we live in a culture where we have more food than we need. That's why most of Americans are fat. We have so much food available to us. We can eat all the time. But the idea that their heaven was called happy fields of food shows you what a struggle it was to eat back in that time period. Heaven to them was being able to have food available. So you guys, the Egyptians would see you as in heaven right now because you never have to go hungry. And that was really important to them. And how did they get that food? By controlling the Nile, doing irrigation, using that rich silt to fertilize their crops. There are records in the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian story about a man named Gilgamesh who's a hero. I'm sure somewhere in college you're going to be studying that story, most of you. And in this Epic of Gilgamesh, they mention a big flood that destroys the world, and an older man who saves a remnant, his family. And that's a familiar story to a lot of you, but they have found evidence that there was a big flood there about 4,900 years ago. So that was just something that I thought was interesting. But they wanted to have public works. What are public works? What do you think a public work would be in Sumeria, an important one? Yes, Riley.
Like building a marketplace or like roads.
Yes, roads and marketplace. What else can you think of? Real important to their survival. Yes. Irrigation systems. Good. Anyone else have another one? Yeah.
Walls.
Walls to protect the city. Well, the irrigation was probably the most vital because that's what gave them food. And if you're going to have a bunch of people build an irrigation system or a wall, do you just say to everybody, okay, go build a wall, and one person starts building it over there and another builds it over there? Would that work? No. And so what they did was they put their important people who ended up being the temple priests. They were work managers. They would organize people to do the irrigation systems, to build walls. So they had, their temple priests did more than just work in the temple. They actually organized people to help them get projects done. Now the first cities in Sumer, you just did on your timeline. When was the earliest city in Sumer? What year? First year on your timeline, what was it? 3200. And that was Sumer. And that was on what rivers?
Tigris and Euphrates.
Tigris and Euphrates. And then when did the first kingdom of Egypt come along?
3100.
Okay. Nope, I don't think that's right. The first kingdom, the old kingdom. When did the old kingdom start?
27.
27.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, the old kingdom. That's what we're looking for. So the old kingdom, 2700. And what river was that on?
The Nile.
Nile.
Okay. Now, there was a historian named Herodotus, and he called the Nile, he said, Egypt is wholly a product of the Nile. Wholly as in W-H-O-L-L-Y, like completely. He said, Egypt is completely a product of the Nile. Who can tell me, what do you think that meant? Yes, Joy.
They depended so much on the river for everything, and that's what made them.
Okay, great. What were you going to say?
Like, yeah, if the Nile wasn't there, Egypt would have never existed.
Right. What would be there if the Nile wasn't there?
Desert.
Desert. Yes, this is a big desert area, so they would have just been out in the desert. No good. Okay, so 2700 was the beginning of the Old Kingdom. Also, they found evidence of silk making way back then, which is kind of interesting. Okay, and the next one is India. When was India? 2500, good. And what are the rivers? Indus and Ganges. You know, we're going to say this so much you'll be saying it in your sleep. And what happened next was China, and that was 2200. That's when there were people in all these places before this, but we're talking about the point at which cities began to emerge and civilizations. So they began to emerge in China about this time, and they were also near rivers, 2 rivers. What were they? Huanghe, which is spelled like this. He means river. Huanghe and the Yangs. Now, this has so many spellings I cannot tell you. I think the one in your book uses TZI, doesn't it? It might use SI. But,
This was Yang and then.
oh, it's just ZI. ZI, okay.
How did you come to the name?
ZI. Now, if you're Chinese and you look on the map and see where that river is, and you could tell me what it's really called, I would appreciate it.
Changjiang.
What is it?
It's called Changjiang. It's the longest,
Changjiang?
it's the longest river in China, right?
It means long river, doesn't it? Changjiang. Okay. All right.
Very original.
It's hard to speak Chinese, you guys. When I try to speak Chinese, I really admire them more for learning English because the 2 languages are so incredibly different. One of my students was trying to teach me to count, and she said, your first letter is E. So I said, E. She goes, no. I said, that's what you said. No, I didn't. I said, E. E. No, that's not what I said. I'm like having this fit, you know. She says, no, you're saying E. No, don't say E. Don't say E. Don't say E. Say E.
There's like, I think
4 or 5
songs
ways
for
to say
one
the letter E.
song.
So she says them to me. E, 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 E. That's what I hear. I hear E, 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 E. But when your ear gets tuned in, you hear that it's different. Okay, so who have I got? Say the 4 ways to say E. Okay, did you hear a difference? There's a distinct difference. Okay, you say the 4 E's.
E.
Say the 4 E's.
E, 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 E.
Do you hear the difference? It takes a while.
Barely, I don't know.
I know.
I don't think I could learn their language like they've learned mine. That's
So
incredible.
are you impressed? I'm impressed. Okay, so let's go back to Sumer. And now we know Sumer is the first of our great civilizations that we're learning. And they had some really great advancements. They had the wheeled chariot and wheeled vehicles. They also made bricks, and they would make it out of the clay and earth that was available to them, and they would dry it in molds to build their great cities. Ur was the capital of Sumer at the time period we're talking about, the golden age of Sumer. And Uruk, which in some places is spelled U-R-A-K, here is spelled E-R-E-C-H. So you can tell that historians don't agree on how to spell these places. But trade, being so close to the Mediterranean and having 2 rivers that come right up from the Persian Gulf, they had access to products from all over the world. Archaeologists found things from all over the world in the remains. Now on page 35, I'm going to ask you a question. It's under Sumerian civilization. There are, in each city-state, the ruler was responsible for 4 things. I want you to look at that for a minute and then raise your hand when you can tell me the 4 things that the ruler was responsible for. So look on page 35 and see. Okay, tell me the first 2, Samantha.
Maintaining the city roads and the irrigation systems.
Good. Okay, what were the next ones? Joy.
Leading its armies and enforcing the laws.
Okay, good. So those are the 4 responsibilities of whom?
The ruler.
Their ruler, right. Now, scribes. This scribe thing is incredibly interesting because it was a lot of training to be trained as a scribe. It was hard work. And they would be in school learning to be a scribe. If they were fast and really gifted and showed that they were smart, they would be taught all the other areas of learning as well. If they were just making it as a scribe, they just stayed a scribe. So scribe in this culture actually means academic. These were the academicians of their society. So the scribes had responsibilities too. They had 2 of them. What were their 2 responsibilities? Let's see, I haven't heard from Khan. What were the 2 responsibilities of the scribe?
I don't know.
Okay. Tanner's brother, I forgot your name.
Jaden.
Pardon?
Jaden.
Jaden. Can you tell me the 2 responsibilities of a scribe? Anyone want to rescue him? What are they?
One was to like take record of things
Mm-hmm,
said,
yep.
and what's the other one?
Who knows? Yes,
Collecting tax.
collecting taxes.
That's
So, does it require, if you're a court reporter or something, you have to keep records? But remember, Sumerians are business people, so most of the records we found left behind by them were business transactions, though that is definitely not all they left behind. Business transactions were really a big deal. And collecting taxes. You know, if you pay your taxes, you could get this little clay thing for a receipt. This person paid their taxes. Then if they try to take your taxes again, you go, see, I have the stone, says I paid. So they recorded things on these clay things, which is great for us, because if 3,000 years ago they'd done all this writing on paper, how much of it do you think we'd have left? Yeah, not much, that's right. So we're lucky that they did this, because a lot of it survived for us to study and learn about these people. Okay, now also on page 35, the next section I want you to look at is the social hierarchy of the Sumerian culture. I want to know what the hierarchy is. There's 4 levels. So who can tell me the 4 levels of the hierarchy of the Sumerians? Yes.
The high class.
Okay, which would be who was the high class one?
Ruling family.
The ruling family and the priest. Okay, good. What's number 2?
The middle class.
All right, and what were they made up of?
like
Priests and
priests.
scribes.
Priests and scribes. So our important scribes here. We're in the middle class. That's number 2. Number 3. What's number 3? Do you know what number 3 is? Okay. Do you have your book?
No, Kyra has it, because he doesn't have a book.
Okay, and where is she?
I think she went to Russia.
Okay, so you need to use your book. Every once in a while I say, who has their book, and I give you 10 bonus points, so remember your book. Okay, number 3, who can tell me what that one is?
It's like peasant.
Yes, peasants and farmers, good. And then the last one, we're not people that were very happy, but can you tell who the 4th class was? Slaves, very good. So we had the ruling class and priests at the top. The middle class was the scribes and the merchants. The 3rd class was, most of the people were in the 3rd class category. There were lots of farmers. And then the lowest class would be the slaves. Now, in many cultures today, after the slaves, or even with the slaves, would have been the women. But in early Sumerian culture, women had rights. They had a lot of rights in the beginning. When their god was Inanna, the mother goddess, it showed respect for women. And the mentality in the beginning of Sumer was really respectful to women. But as time went on and warrior leaders started to develop in their culture, what do you think would make warrior leaders all of a sudden become important in a culture? What would be happening that they would become so important?
War.
Okay, they'd be attacked, and Sumerians did start fighting with each other, so warrior leaders became, the heroes of the day, the movie stars, and they started to become leaders. Then the gods started changing the primary gods from female to male, and when that happened, the women's status went down a bit. Even though women still did have legal rights and they could own property in Sumer, which is better than other cultures that we've studied about. Okay, so we're talking now, what we just talked about was their civilization, how they organized their civilization, the classes they had and what their responsibilities were. So we can get an idea of this culture. If I walk into this city, I'm going to see buildings made out of bricks, right? We see brick buildings. Sorry there, Yoda. And I'm going to see streets and irrigation systems, men and women on the streets. The men usually wore, does anyone remember what the men usually wore in Sumerian culture? Yeah, cloths, about down to their knees and tied at the waist. That was they wore those like skirts.
So like a kilt?
Yes, they wore something similar to a kilt. And women had draped cloth, similar to what you think of when you think of a Greek woman, just draped cloth, but the richer they were, the fancier the cloth was. So I'd see people walking around like that. I'd see men in their kilts, or whatever we want to call them, conducting business. I'd see scribes working on tablets. I'd see peasants out in the fields. So if we try to go back in a little time capsule in our mind, we can get sort of a blurry picture of what we would see, right? And one of the neatest pictures is on the next page, and that was their religious temples. What were their religious temples called? Ivan? Ziggurats. Very good, ziggurats. And they were built sort of wedding cake style. From a distance, they look like a wedding cake going up like this. But they did have ramps going around so people could get to the top. They had stairs. And so what did they worship in these ziggurats? Their gods. And their gods were originally based on natural things, like the sun god, the rain god, the god of the harvest, the mother god. Those were the kinds of gods polytheistic societies usually had. Different elements of nature. They were gods with passions. They weren't like the God of the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians is a God who's organized and good, ultimately good and always right. Not these gods. They were like powerful people. So they had a lot of passions. They could get mad at you and then you were in big trouble. So to appease these gods, what did they do? Sacrifices. And they sacrificed some of their produce. You know, they would sacrifice the things of the land. What else? Anyone remember? Did they sacrifice people?
No, animals.
No, animals, that's right. They sacrificed animals, wine, which is really precious to them, and grains from their field. And they would sacrifice these to stay on the good side of these gods. What a drag, huh? They did believe in an afterlife, but as we discussed right in the beginning, they didn't think it was really great. So let me read you, in fact, one of you on page 36 who has a good loud voice. Would you read me the description from the Epic of Gilgamesh of what the afterlife was like? Do you see it there? It starts with the place.
The
Okay.
place where they live on dust, their food is mud, and they see no night, living in darkness on the door and doorbolt, deeply settled dust.
Oh, that sounds charming, doesn't it? The place where they live in dust. I don't like dust. And eat mud, and it's black. Now, that would not make you very looking forward to death. You know, in the prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi, the one that starts out, Lord, where there is hate, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is distress, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And he goes on with all these things. In the end, he says, for it is in giving that we receive, it is in parting that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are given eternal life. And he thought that was a great thing. Oh, when we die, we get eternal life. This is great. You guys already figured out you're not going to have the quiz today, right? But that only means that you have to have another one on Monday. Should we try it right now? I don't think so. I don't think we have enough time. Okay, so he said, you know, when we die, we get eternal life. And Francis of Assisi thought, wow, that's great. Did the Sumerians feel that way? No. So let me ask you a question, and we'll stop here. If you thought that when you died, it was going to be like that, what would you want to do in this? How valuable would this life be to you, and what would you want out of this life?
Super valuable, like do everything you can.
Yes, do everything you can, because when you die, it's going to be hell.
They
Yeah,
could
it's gonna be
also be
horrible.
living in fear that one day they die and then be...
Yes, more
So,
fearful
like-
of death, much more fearful
Probably
of
if they
death.
got sick, they were like really scared to be touched.
Yes, yes. You know, it's kind of like the eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die philosophy, right? You ever heard that? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. This was a Sumerian mentality. Look again at their advances in learning, and you're going to read the last section over the weekend, and it is one that is on the development of the Jewish religion, which is the roots of Christianity and Islam. Islam and Christianity grew out of the Jewish religion, which you're going to learn, and some of you know quite a bit about already. So read section 5. When you come back, we'll do all 3 sections, but I'll do some more review with you first. So section 5, the roots of Judaism. All right.